5 years to waste because of my marriage. After I discovered a single email that turned my world upside down. I never thought a random Tuesday afternoon would shatter my world. Funny how life's biggest moments sneak up on you like that. I was in our home office, organizing tax documents for our accountant, when David's MacBook chimed with a new email. The preview flashed across the screen. Missing you already. These stolen moments aren't enough anymore. Claire. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding against my ribs. David, my husband of 8 years, was supposed to be in Chicago for a medical conference. He was a respected neurologist, and these trips were routine, twice a month, sometimes more. I'd packed his suitcase yesterday, pressed his shirts the way he liked them, even slipped in his favorite protein bars for late-night hospital rounds. The cursor blinked at me, taunting. I hadn't meant to snoop, but there it was. One click would either confirm my worst fears or prove me paranoid. I clicked. The email thread unfolded like a horror story. Claire wasn't just some random woman. She was the pharmaceutical rep who frequently visited David's practice. Their correspondence went back 3 years. 3 years of business trips that were actually romantic getaways. 3 years of lies served with goodbye kisses and welcome home hugs. The cabin in Aspen was perfect. One email read, "Next time, let's stay a whole week. Your wife never questions these trips anyway." My hands trembled as I scrolled through their intimate exchanges. Photos of them together at beaches, restaurants, and hotels. All places David had claimed to be at medical conferences. He'd built an entire parallel life while I managed our real one, handling our investment properties, maintaining our social calendar, and planning for the family we talked about starting next year. The worst part? I recognized some of the gifts in their photos, the Rolex I'd helped him pick out for his colleague last Christmas, the designer scarf he'd bought during our anniversary trip to Paris that got lost in his luggage. All of them had gone to Claire. I sat there for hours, methodically copying every email, every photo, every hotel receipt into a secure folder. The sun set, casting long shadows across our perfect home with its perfect furniture and perfectly curated life. Everything felt hollow now, tainted by lies. My phone buzzed, a text from David. "Just finished today's sessions. Missing you. Beautiful. Can't wait to be home Friday." I stared at his message, this casual lie sent from a luxury hotel where he was probably holding Claire right now. The anger that rose in me wasn't hot or explosive. It was cold, calculating, and crystal clear. David hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He'd made me an unwitting accomplice in his deception. 8 years together, and I realized I'd been living in a carefully constructed fantasy. But here's the thing about fantasies, they're fragile. One crack, and the whole thing shatters. As I sat in our home office, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, I made a decision. This wouldn't be a messy confrontation or a tearful showdown. No, David had spent 3 years crafting his perfect lie. I would take my time dismantling it, piece by perfect piece. I texted back, "Miss you too, honey. Focus on those sessions. Everything's fine at home." Then I opened my laptop and began to plan. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in deception. Every morning, I woke up next to David, kissed him goodbye, and played the role of devoted wife while secretly building my case. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd become what he was, a liar in our bed. The difference? My lies had an expiration date. I hired Sarah Mitchell, the best divorce attorney in Boston, the day after discovering the emails. She was exactly what I needed: ruthless, discreet, and familiar with cases involving high-net-worth medical professionals. "Document everything," she advised during our first meeting. "Bank statements, travel records, communications. Leave no stone unturned." I did more than document. I became a ghost in David's perfectly crafted lie, watching as he moved through our life with practiced ease. The signs I'd missed before now screamed at me. How he always kept his phone face down, the way he'd step out for emergency consults during dinner parties, those extra hours at the gym that never seemed to change his physique. The real breakthrough came when I discovered his second phone, hidden in a locked drawer in his home office. I found it while he was performing a complex surgery, actually a romantic weekend with Claire in Vermont, according to their emails. The phone was a treasure trove of information. Intimate messages, hotel reservations, even plans for their future together. "We'll tell her after the new year." One message from David to Claire read, "Once the Anderson contract is secured, I'll have enough set aside. You're worth losing everything for." The Anderson contract. Now that was interesting. It was a major pharmaceutical deal David's practice was negotiating. One that would bring in millions. One that, as his wife and business partner in the practice's real estate holdings, I had significant influence over. I picked up my phone and called James Anderson directly. We'd met at several charity events, and he'd always been particularly friendly. "James? It's Alexandra. I hope I'm not interrupting, but I'd love to discuss the upcoming contract over lunch. There are some Concerns I think we should address. 2 hours later, I sat across from James at Le Bernardin, wearing the Cartier bracelet David had given me for our last anniversary. Probably a guilt gift, I realize now. The conversation was enlightening. To be honest, Alexandra, we've had reservations about the partnership, James admitted, swirling his wine. The numbers David presented seemed optimistic, but given your family's reputation and your involvement in the practice's management, I smiled, thinking of the practice's real estate portfolio I'd built over the years. Actually, James, I'm glad you mentioned that. I believe it's time for some significant changes in our organizational structure. By the time lunch ended, I'd secured two things. James's word that he'd delay signing the contract for at least 2 months, and his promise to keep our conversation confidential. David's perfect plan was already starting to crack. That evening, I received a text from Claire herself. She'd finally grown bold enough to message my number directly. We need to talk. About David. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, yes, we do. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Bristol Lounge. David was scheduled for surgery then, a real one this time. I'd checked the hospital schedule myself. Everything was falling into place, piece by perfect piece. That night, as I lay beside David listening to his steady breathing, I thought about the life we'd built together. The practice we'd grown, the homes we'd bought, the future we'd planned. He slept peacefully, unaware that his carefully constructed world was balanced on a knife's edge. I turned away from him, opening my phone to confirm my appointment with Claire. Tomorrow would change everything. But first, I had one more call to make, to Claire's husband, Michael. After all, he deserved to know the truth too. The Bristol Lounge was busy when I arrived, exactly how I wanted it. Claire was already there, perched at a corner table like a bird about to take flight. She was beautiful in that effortless way that made me understand David's attraction. Long dark hair, expensive clothes that looked casual, the kind of woman who belonged in the life David pretended to have. I sat down across from her, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her coffee cup. So different from the confident woman in those photos with my husband. Alexandra, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know where to begin. How about we begin with why you're really here? I kept my voice level, watching her face carefully, because we both know this isn't about suddenly developing a conscience. She flinched. David doesn't know I'm meeting you. He'd be furious if he knew. David's feelings stopped being my concern when he started sharing them with you. I pulled out my phone, placed it on the table. But let's talk about Michael's feelings. The color drained from her face. You spoke to my husband? Not yet. I smiled, the same smile I'd been practicing in the mirror for weeks. That depends entirely on this conversation. Claire's composure cracked. Please, you don't understand. Michael, he'd destroy me in a divorce. The prenup is ironclad, I know. I had my lawyer review it. I took a sip of my water, letting that sink in. No fault clause, full disclosure requirement. Infidelity means you walk away with nothing. Tears welled in her eyes. Alexandra, save it. I cut her off. I'm not interested in your apologies or explanations. I'm interested in justice. So here's what's going to happen. I laid out my terms clearly, watching her face as each one landed like a physical blow. By the time I finished, she was openly crying, mascara tracking down her cheeks. You want me to help you destroy him? Her voice cracked. No, Claire. I want you to help me give him exactly what he deserves. I pulled out a manila envelope. Everything you need to know is in here. Times, dates, what to say. Follow the script, and Michael never finds out about your indiscretions. Deviate even slightly. I let the threat hang in the air. She took the envelope with shaking hands. When? 2 weeks. The Anderson contract signing. That's your deadline. As I stood to leave, she grabbed my wrist. Wait, there's something you should know. About David's practice, about where the money's really coming from. I sat back down, my heart pounding. I'm listening. What she told me over the next hour changed everything. David's perfect lie wasn't just about infidelity. It was about fraud, money laundering, and a web of deception that went far beyond our marriage. I left the Bristol Lounge with a new understanding of just how deep this rabbit hole went. Claire had given me more ammunition than I'd ever expected, but she'd also raised the stakes dramatically. That night, David called from his conference. How's Chicago, honey? I asked, my voice sweet as poison. Busy. Missing you. He paused. Everything okay? You sound different. Everything's perfect, I replied, watching his location on my phone, blinking from a hotel in New York, not Chicago. Just perfect. After hanging up, I made 3 calls, one to my lawyer, one to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and one to schedule a meeting with the hospital board. David thought he was playing chess. He didn't realize we were playing different games entirely. 3 days before the Anderson contract signing, I was ready. Like a conductor before a symphony, I had all my players in position. David, still blissfully unaware, was practically glowing with anticipation of his upcoming triumph. The Anderson deal will change everything, he said over dinner that night, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. We'll finally be able to start that family we talked about. I squeezed back, thinking about the offshore accounts I discovered, the falsified medical trials, the kickbacks. Yes, honey, everything will change. That night, as David slept, I made my final preparations. The evidence Claire had provided proved invaluable: documents showing how David had manipulated drug trial data, emails detailing kickback schemes with pharmaceutical companies, even recordings of conversations about fraudulent billing practices. The scope of his deception was breathtaking. But the real bombshell came from an unexpected source. Remember Michael, Claire's husband? 5 years to waste because of my marriage. After I discovered a single email that turned my world upside down, I never thought a random Tuesday afternoon would shatter my world. Funny how life's biggest moments sneak up on you like that. I was in our home office, organizing tax documents for our accountant, when David's MacBook chimed with a new email. The preview flashed across the screen. Missing you already. These stolen moments aren't enough anymore. Claire. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding against my ribs. David, my husband of 8 years, was supposed to be in Chicago for a medical conference. He was a respected neurologist, and these trips were routine, twice a month, sometimes more. I'd packed his suitcase yesterday, pressed his shirts the way he liked them, even slipped in his favorite protein bars for late-night hospital rounds. The cursor blinked at me, taunting. I hadn't meant to snoop, but there it was. One click would either confirm my worst fears or prove me paranoid. I clicked. The email thread unfolded like a horror story. Claire wasn't just some random woman. She was the pharmaceutical rep who frequently visited David's practice. Their correspondence went back 3 years. 3 years of business trips that were actually romantic getaways. 3 years of lies served with goodbye kisses and welcome home hugs. The cabin in Aspen was perfect, one email read. The meeting began. David stood at the podium, confident and charismatic as ever, presenting the Anderson contract. He was in his element, spinning his web of lies with practiced ease. I watched the board members nodding along, completely taken in by his performance. Then, right on cue, Claire stood up. I have something to say, she announced, her voice shaking slightly. About the trial data. David's smile flickered. Claire, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time, I interrupted, standing as well. Tell them, Claire. Tell them everything. What followed was 30 minutes of calculated destruction. Claire, following my script perfectly, laid out the entire fraud scheme. I provided the documentation, Michael added his legal expertise, and the federal agents who had been quietly waiting outside entered at exactly the right moment. The look on David's face as his perfect world crumbled around him. I'll never forget it. Confusion turned to disbelief, then to fury as he realized the depth of my involvement in his downfall. Why? He demanded as the agents approached. After everything we built together? I stepped close to him, my voice low enough that only he could hear. Because you made me an unknowing accomplice in your crimes. Because you risked not just our marriage, but my freedom with your schemes. But mostly, because you were stupid enough to think I wouldn't figure it out. The agents led him away in handcuffs, past the shocked board members, past Claire who couldn't meet his eyes, past the life he'd built on lies and fraud. As he passed me, I slipped my wedding ring into his pocket. One last gift for the road. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. There was still one more act to play out, and it would be the sweetest revenge of all. The weeks following David's arrest were a hurricane of media coverage, legal proceedings, and revelations. But while everyone focused on the medical fraud scandal, I executed the final phase of my plan, the one that would hurt David more than any criminal charges. Remember those investment properties I managed? The ones that were technically in both our names? While David was busy playing doctor with Claire and cooking books, I'd been quietly restructuring our assets. Every property, every investment, every account I had legal access to. I'd spent months carefully moving things around, always staying just within the bounds of legality. The timing is crucial, Sarah, my lawyer, had warned during one of our planning sessions. Too soon, and he'll notice. Too late, and the feds might freeze everything. I timed it perfectly. By the time the FBI started their asset seizure, most of our liquid wealth had been legally transferred into trusts and holdings that David couldn't touch. He hadn't even noticed, too distracted by Claire and his schemes to pay attention to the boring paperwork his dutiful wife handled. But the real masterpiece? The practice itself. Those 3 properties the medical practice operated from, the ones David thought were owned by a holding company, I'd restructured ownership months ago. The holding company was now solely in my name, and the practice's lease agreements were ironclad. 1 week after David's arrest, I called a meeting with the remaining partners. Gentlemen, I addressed the shell-shocked doctors who'd worked alongside David for years. We need to discuss the future of this practice. They'd expected me to be broken, perhaps even sympathetic to David. Instead, they found themselves facing a woman who'd spent months preparing for this exact moment. The practice needs new leadership, I continued, laying out contracts my lawyers had prepared. I propose a restructuring. The properties will remain under my management, but you'll have the opportunity to buy into the practice itself, under new terms, of course. One of the older partners, Dr. Richardson, shifted uncomfortably. Alexandra, while we appreciate your position, perhaps given the circumstances. The circumstances, I cut in smoothly, are that I own these buildings. I hold the majority stake in the practice's real estate, and I have enough evidence of willful ignorance among the partners to make the board very uncomfortable. So shall we discuss those new terms? By the end of that meeting, I'd secured my position as the managing partner of the restructured practice, with a guaranteed income that would make David's previous salary look like pocket change. That evening, I visited David in detention. He'd been denied bail, given the flight risk and the magnitude of the fraud charges. Seeing him in prison orange instead of his usual tailored suits was jarring. "You've destroyed everything," he said as soon as I sat down. "Years of work, our future." "No, David. You destroyed everything the moment you decided to betray not just our marriage, but your oath as a doctor. I just made sure you faced the consequences." His face darkened. "At least I'll still have half of everything when this is over. The properties, the practice." I smiled, sliding a document across the table. "Actually, you might want to read this. It's amazing what you miss when you're too busy with your mistress to read the paperwork your wife puts in front of you." I watched as he read through the document, the one he'd signed months ago, distracted by a phone call from Claire, giving me full control of our joint assets in the event of legal complications. "You can't do this," he whispered, face ashen. "I already have." I stood up. "Oh, and Claire? She's testifying against you for full immunity. Turns out she values her freedom more than your love. Funny how that works." As I turned to leave, he called out, "I did love you, Alex. In my way." I paused at the door. "Your way wasn't good enough." Walking out of that detention center, I felt lighter than I had in years. David faced decades in prison for the fraud charges. The practice was thriving under new leadership. And me? I had emerged from the ashes of his deception stronger and wealthier than ever. But there was one last piece of justice to deliver. One final act that would ensure David understood exactly what he'd lost. 1 year to the day after David's arrest, I sat in my office, formerly his office, reviewing the practice's quarterly reports. The restructuring had been a massive success. Under my management, revenue had doubled, and our reputation had recovered from David's scandal. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael, Claire's now ex-husband. "Turn on Channel 7. You'll want to see this." The news anchor's voice filled the room. "Breaking news in the Metropolitan Medical Fraud case. Dr. David Chun has been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The former neurologist pleaded guilty to multiple charges of fraud, conspiracy, and medical malpractice." I smiled, thinking about the letter sitting in my desk drawer. David had sent it last week, probably hoping to sway me before his sentencing. 8 pages of apologies, explanations, and pleas for help. I hadn't bothered responding. Instead, I'd sent him divorce papers and a USB drive containing a video, security footage from every hotel he'd visited with Claire, every secret meeting, every lie. I'd had them compiled into a neat little montage, set to our wedding song. Petty? Perhaps. Satisfying? Absolutely. My assistant knocked on the door. "Dr. Harrison is here for your lunch meeting." Thomas Harrison, the brilliant young neurologist I'd hired to replace David. He'd helped rebuild the practice's reputation, and somewhere along the way, we developed a connection I hadn't expected. "Ready for lunch?" he asked, leaning against my doorframe with a warmth that made my heart skip. "Actually," I said, grabbing my coat, "I have somewhere special in mind." We drove to the Bristol Lounge, the same place where I'd confronted Claire a year ago. As we sat at that same corner table, Thomas reached across and took my hand. "Alexandra," he started, "I know this past year has been incredible professionally, but I think we both know it's become more than that." I squeezed his hand, thinking about how different this felt from David's calculated affection. Thomas knew everything. The scandal, the revenge, all of it, and still looked at me with genuine admiration. "I have something for you," I said, pulling out an envelope. Inside was the final piece of my revenge against David. Papers showing I'd donated his beloved Ferrari, the one thing he'd begged me to keep safe for him, to a women's shelter. They'd auctioned it off last week. Thomas read the papers and laughed. "You're something else, You know that? I do, I replied, thinking of how far I'd come. But there's one more thing. I handed him another envelope, the keys to a new medical research center I'd been secretly developing. A center that would conduct legitimate trials, help real patients, and stand as a testament to everything David had failed to be. I want you to run it, I told him. With me. His face lit up with genuine excitement, so different from David's practiced charm. As he talked about his vision for the center, I felt the last pieces of my old life falling away. Later that night, I received one final text from Claire. David saw the news about the Ferrari. He's furious. Thank you for keeping your promise about Michael. I hope you find happiness. I didn't respond. Instead, I curled up on my couch with a glass of wine and opened my laptop to review the research center's plans. My phone buzzed again. Thomas sending a funny meme about medical research. I laughed, really laughed, for what felt like the first time in years. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just about destroying someone's world. It's about building something better from the ruins they left behind. David had taught me that betrayal comes wrapped in perfect lies, but he'd also taught me my own strength. As I looked out over the city lights, I raised my glass in a silent toast. To new beginnings, to justice served cold, and to the sweet, sweet taste of victory.